Well, thank you very much for coming to my TEDx talk tonight here on uncertainty. I think I must be an expert in the field because as I was preparing for this talk, I tried to list all the things that I was absolutely certain of, and it was a very short list. As a matter of fact, there was only a couple items on that list, and we share one of those items. As a matter of fact, we're all on different paths right now, leading to different roads, but we're all going to the same place. And that same place is right here. All headed? The cemetery. Now, if we accept the fact that all of our paths are eventually leading there, the reality is that every minute of our lives matter, and we want to fill those minutes with something that's truly extraordinary. Now, while we may accept this, please do me a favor and your neighbor a favor, and please don't die within the next 18 minutes, because it could get very messy, and I could never live down the headline, TEDx talk kills in Hong Kong, literally. But if we do accept the fact that this is where we're all headed, then we go ahead and take a good look at the present where we are now. Because in reality, most of us don't know how long the path is between right now and right there, although we're all winding up right there. However, there are people who do know. People may have been diagnosed with a serious illness, or people who are faced with tragic circumstances. We wake up every day with the certainty that this isn't our future, but we don't think about that. We think about, though, as the general routines. We do expect to wake up fresh in the morning. We do expect when we turn the switch for the power to come on. We do expect when we turn the faucet that the water comes. We go to the MTR station that the train shows up. And for those of us who might be traveling by air, we strap ourselves in, we listen to the flight attendant, and we expect to be able to get to our destination safely. But you know that doesn't always happen. As a matter of fact, on January 13th, 1982, 75 passengers strapped themselves into the seats of Air Florida Flight 90. They were getting ready to leave Washington National Airport, United States, headed towards Tampa, Florida, and then eventually Fort Lauderdale, Florida. It was desperately cold in Washington, D.C. that day. It had been snowing, it had been icing, and I'm sure those 75 passengers and crew were looking for a little respite in sunny Florida in the beginning of January. Unfortunately, they wouldn't make it. As Air Florida Flight 90 was taxiing off the runway, unfortunately, the pilots had not properly de-iced the wings. And in moments of terror, what seemed like certainty, or at least an expectation of safety, was quickly turned upside down as the airplane clipped the 14th Street Bridge, damaging 7 vehicles, killing 4 people, and landing in the Potomac River 2 miles from the White House. Now, where Air Florida Flight 90 landed in the middle of the Potomac was too difficult to be reached by land. So people, the passers-by and those willing to help had to wait for the Forest Service to arrive by helicopter. When the Forest Service arrived by helicopter, they noticed that there were passengers that had crawled out of the back of the aircraft. There were 6 passengers in total they could count, and as the helicopter came in closer, they could see that there appeared to be one man who was in charge. A balding man with a big mustache. And what was happening was they could see that he was somehow organizing the people as they're coming out of the back of the aircraft. Well, as the helicopter lowered itself with its lifeline, which, by the way, is very dangerous in stormy weather, they passed that lifeline to the man who seemed to be in charge, this balding man in a mustache, expecting him to grab the lifeline and come with them, but he didn't. He passed the lifeline to yet another passenger, this time a flight attendant. You can see from this photograph here the action taking place on that January day. Well, the first person who was rescued was a flight attendant, and she was taken safely to the embankment. The helicopter came back with the lifeline and again passed it to the man in the water for him to go ahead and for him to come and join the embankment. But no, he passed the lifeline again to yet another passenger. So a second person is taken from the wreckage to the safety of the bank. The third time, the helicopter comes back. Again, the man in the water passes the lifeline to another passenger. It happens a fourth time, and it happens a fifth time. 5 people are rescued. They're on safe ground. The helicopter returns for the man who had risked his life for everyone else, only to discover that he must have succumbed to hypothermia because he had drowned and he had disappeared from sight. Now, we watch this. We, the world, watch this on television. And there is a magazine called Time Magazine, and their editor-in-chief at that time, Roger Rosenblatt, wrote a very powerful essay called "The Man in the Water." And what was so powerful about that essay is he was able to capture for us why this man held our attention. First of all, it was absolutely sheer poetry, the idea of man versus nature. That man had no power over nature. He had no power over the fate of that aircraft, but he did have power to give his life for others. And not just one, but 5 people. Also, what was powerful, we didn't know for a very long time who this man was. So his anonymity made him famous. But what most made him famous was his sacrifice. He provided a lifeline to those survivors, but he also provided a lifeline for all of us. Because as Professor Chan was mentioning earlier, the veil behind uncertainty is fear. And unfortunately, fear can keep us from taking the risks that we need to do, reaching out to do the things that we're called to do. And this man faced his uncertainty, the certainty that he must have known if he kept passing that lifeline that he wouldn't survive. But yet, he continued to do so. He faced uncertainty with sacrifice, and he faced uncertainty with the ability to go ahead and give his life for others. If you find yourself in Washington, D.C., and you're driving around, you'll find that the 14th Street Bridge has been renamed. It's now called the Arland D. Williams Jr. Bridge. And if you pass that, you can tell your friends in your car, because he wasn't a president of the United States, but he was the man in the water, and you can tell his story. There's an area of psychology you're probably familiar with, and you may have studied it yourself if you're a psychology major, and one of the anxiety disorders known as post-traumatic stress. A lot of research has been done on PTSD, first of all by veterans from war, and then other people who have been survivors of accidents like a plane crash, some kind of traumatic event. But I'm most interested in a new area developing from this area of research called post-traumatic growth. The growth that occurs in some people as a result of a traumatic event. I don't think there's anything more traumatic in the life of anybody than the death of a child. And the growth that can come from that can be phenomenal. There's a story of a family that Huffington Post has written about fairly recently. It traveled through the internet, and Huffington Post wanted to find out what's the real story behind this, because it's almost too good to be true. So they went ahead and interviewed all the major players. There was a woman, 26 years old, single, 5-year-old son who was ill. She took him to the hospital in Phoenix, Arizona, only to find out that he had leukemia, terminal leukemia. She didn't really know what to do, but she developed a very close relationship with the oncologist who was treating her son, Bopsy. His full name was Frank Salazar, but she called him Bopsy. The doctor had been very close with another family, a woman who'd lost her 7-year-old son to leukemia very recently. But she and a group of police officers who had made her son's life very special towards the end, had started a new charity, a new foundation they wanted to go ahead and do to go ahead and raise awareness for children who are suffering in the last moments of life. They wanted to make their moments count. They wanted to make their wishes come true. And they started a charity called Make-A-Wish Foundation, which you've probably heard about. because they touched the lives of many terminally ill children around the world. Bopsy was the very first Make-A-Wish Foundation recipient. And the way it worked is the doctor told Bopsy's mom about this. Bopsy's mom contacted the Make-A-Wish people. The police officer went out and interviewed Bopsy and said, if you had a wish, what would you wish to come true? Well, his first wish was to take a balloon ride, hot air balloon ride. Second wish was to go ahead and go to Disneyland. Third wish, well, he wanted to become a fireman when he grew up. Well, the police officer could easily take care of the first two with the fledgling foundation. Don't know if you realize, but Arizona is home to hot air ballooning, particularly first thing in the morning. The nature of the climate there, that was easy. A trip to Disneyland, no problem. As a matter of fact, it set up a long-standing relationship between the Disney parks and the Make-A-Wish Foundation, because as you can imagine, a trip to Disney is on the wish of many children's wish list, let alone those that are very ill. But lastly, that trip to making him a fireman would take a little bit more work. So his mother contacted the Phoenix Fire Department. And fortunately, she got in touch with a fellow named Fireman Bob. Fireman Bob you see pictured there. She told Fireman Bob the story that her son was desperately ill, that he didn't have long to live, but he'd always wished to be a firefighter. Would he mind if she took her son out for a ride in a fire truck so he'd have that experience? Fireman Bob's response was epic. He said, whoa, we could do better than that. You send me his sizes, we can actually have a real fireman's hat, a real fireman's jacket, a badge and boots, because they're all made here in Phoenix. Let's do this right. So several weeks later, the appointed time arrives, and there's 5-year-old Bopsy getting on his Phoenix Fireman Department uniform and spends a day going out with the Phoenix Fire Department, going to rescue calls and being part of the team. The department didn't end there. They continued connection with that family through the extra months that Bopsy lived. It was a surprise to everyone. However, when the end became inevitable, the hospital notified the firefighters that if they wanted to come see Bopsy for one last time, they better do so now. And they informed the hospital they'd be on their way, but not for anyone to panic if they see the truck coming. So the fire truck peels out, parks outside of St. Joseph's Hospital in Phoenix. They raise the fire ladder to Bopsy's third-floor window. And Fireman Bob and 3 of his colleagues climb that ladder, bang on Bopsy's window. Bopsy's elated, shocked that they're there, and they climb through the ladder to his room to be with him. He's so moved by this, he says, Mommy, let me go down and see them at the truck. Let me see my team. Well, they went down there to see the team, and as they exit St. Joseph's Hospital, they see the fire engine has been renamed. The new name for the fire truck is B1 for Bopsy 1. Bopsy turned to Fireman Bob and said, am I a real fireman now? And Bob said to him, well, of course you are, Bopsy. Bopsy died the next day in the loving arms of his mother, his grandmother, and his aunt. But that boy's last life, those last few months of that boy's life, was filled with more love, more attention than he could have ever imagined, and certainly more than his mother could have ever planned for. They faced the certainty of his death with the joy of being able to fill it with as much love and joy as they possibly could. Not just his mother, but Fireman Bob and the Make-A-Wish Foundation founders in their very first recipient, who they didn't choose a wish, but instead granted them all. Their uncertainty was faced with love and embraced the absolute everything they had for him. But post-traumatic growth can come in many other ways, in many other dimensions. And not everybody who faces tragedy has a loving, supportive family or friends around them. One of the positions that I've held as an educator before I came to Hong Kong was I was a teacher for the homeless. I worked with homeless children and youth. And one of the last students I worked with in that position, let's call him for privacy's sake, Robert. Robert was 15 years old when he came in the shelter with his mother. They'd spent the last year and a half living out of the back of their car in Madeira Beach, Florida. They'd come to the homeless shelter only because his mother was ill. And my job was to get Robert into school, as it was with all our homeless children and youth. Well, we get Robert into school, but just as he's getting settled in school, his mother is quickly hospitalized. And unfortunately, and surprising to all of us, she died not long afterwards. I had to deliver the message to Robert that his mother had died, and I had to take him up to the shelter right away to clear out the room that they shared because the shelter staff needed it back. We went back to the shelter, we cleared it out. All the shelter had were some big black garbage bags, rubbish bags for him to fill up with. There were no suitcases, nothing there. There wasn't much for him to have to fill up, having spent the last year and a half in the back of a car. But he put together what few items that he had, his personal items. He donated all his mother's clothes and her things to the shelter. He did, however, save one small bottle of department store perfume so he could remember her fragrance in better days. But as we left there, he said, "What am I going to do now?" And as we took that 45-minute journey from the homeless shelter to where I was going to have to take him now to a foster home, it suddenly dawned on me that I'd work with a lot of different families. I'd work with great families, I'd work with good families, I'd work with bad families, violent families, abusive families, but I had never dealt with anyone or had a child who was so totally alone. There was literally no family willing or able to take him in. There was no one who was going to take him out for dinner. There was no one to go to the cinema with. There was no one to celebrate his birthday. There was literally nobody in this boy's life. We took him back to the homeless shelter, and he unfortunately was stuck in that chasm where he was too old really for foster care, but too young for transitional care that you would find were 18-year-olds and above. I followed up in the next several months as he was in these various foster homes. On his 16th birthday, fortunately, with the great work of our local social workers and the Department of Children and Families, they were able to get him into a transitional housing. When I tucked him in, so to speak, in his new flat, getting him set up, moving up the last of the things, it would be the last time I would see him face to face. He turned to me and said, "You know, I can do this. I really have hope that things are going to get better." Well, he said that with a smile, and I broke down as soon as I left his apartment because I had never met anybody who had such faith and hope in the future with so little reason to do so. There was nobody else in this boy's life, but he was not going to let that defeat him. Which leads me, if we could move to the next slide. There's a 13th century Persian poet by the name of Rumi, who you've probably come across. We had talked that one of the paralyzing pieces behind uncertainty is this idea of fear. But this quote, "Fear knocked on the door, love answered, and no one was there." It's a pretty powerful vision for us when we think about fear as being part of uncertainty. Because what I've also discovered, there's a certainty of death, but the other certainty that we know we can live with is that love does, in fact, dissolve and dissipate fear. Love is the uniting force that binds us together and reveals our deepest humanity. I've learned that through these stories. I've learned this face to face, and I leave that here with you today. Thank you very much.